A cemetery is probably the best neighbour you could have. If you plant a tree, then it takes up valuable space where we can dig a hole and put a body. I thought, I'll go to an exhumation and just stomach that and see what it's all about. The person was wearing the suit that they'd been buried in, even though the body had been in the ground for over 10 years. And as the body came up out of the ground, it was still quite intact. We don't always have the time to afford because people keep dying. We turn no one away.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with Hamish Coates. Hamish is a registered landscape architect with over 30 years of design experience across a wide range of landscape types. His work spans master planning, strategic planning, detailed design, construction, community engagement and project management. Hamish has tutored design subjects at the University of Melbourne and RMIT and holds a fine arts degree majoring in sculpture. Since joining the Greater Melbourne Cemeteries Trust in 2016, Hamish has focused on shaping cemeteries into culturally diverse, environmentally beneficial spaces for the broader community. Thanks for being with us today, Hamish.
Thanks very much, Catherine. It's really good to be here.
Hamish, I saw you speak last year at Open House's symposium, which I do love, entitled 6 Feet Under, Design and Death. That was quite the title, and what surprised me is the amount of design and consideration that goes into a cemetery. So how did you get started?
Well, I guess I've been practicing for some time now, and what I've learnt in life as in profession is never say never. So I never thought that I would end up in cemeteries when I first started out my career, but I was in business. So I was running a small consultancy at one stage, and I was contacted by another landscape architect who was winding down his company, and they did a bit of cemetery work as well. So he asked me just to help him finish off some jobs so he could wind up his business. But that was kind of prolonged because I took an interest in that and we got on quite well together. So it sort of went on a little bit longer than we both thought, but that gave me a big introduction into the cemetery world. And so that culminated once he departed was an invitation from the Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust to redesign or to prepare a master plan for one part of their site at Springvale, which I thought was just an absolutely fantastic project. And it was like a invited competition, so it was like going back to school again. You know, the hats, the paper and pens were out and the ideas were flowing, and we really got stuck into what cemeteries spaces could be and how they might function into the future. And so at that point, I really started to begin to learn a lot about cemeteries. Didn't win the competition, but that's okay. What that demonstrated to me that it was a really fertile space to be in, and it really piqued my interests.
And what was it, do you think, that piqued your interest, Hamish?
Well, I think that I'd been designing landscapes for all sorts of applications: parks, streetscapes, management plans, private and commercial spaces as well. And it was always seemed to be a little bit of meaning, I guess, lacking in that to some extent. I prefer to just design in the public realm rather than the private or commercial one, just because I think we're dealing with nature and that's, everyone has a right to access that. And so any kind of public or landscape, park or streetscape, for example, has a lot more application and meaning to the everyday person, and that gives me a great deal of satisfaction. The venture into the cemeteries world, though, just took it one step further because it was really about your own sort of mortality and others as well, of course. And the question about death and dying and cemeteries being spaces primarily for the living was a really engaging kind of conundrum and duality and all that kind of thing that really inspire me to think more about what we do for a living and how we live and how we design, how we access our spaces, how we interact with nature and what opportunities there are to do that and so forth. So yeah, it began quite an investigation over the years from project to project.
And what's really interesting is that point that you just raised is that cemeteries, most people would think about them as a place for the dead, but they're already taken care of. It really is a place for the living, isn't it?
Absolutely, that's right. Look, there was one site we have out in the outer suburbs, and I don't know how true this story is, but I did hear that the neighbouring developer who was building a housing estate sort of asked us, can you move your cemetery, please? Because, you're going to scare off my customers. But, a cemetery is probably the best neighbour you could have, but it sort of underlined the fact that people's perceptions of cemeteries are still very much about ghosts and zombies and, terrible, dark, gothic kind of iterations of that. And I guess that was a bit of a starting point for the way I began to investigate design, was that, they aren't these scary places surrounded by big high walls and gates. And I guess that sort of was the departure point for where I wanted to go with cemeteries, which was to open them up and make them more publicly accessible.
And that's really interesting because most people, they have very limited exposure to cemeteries. Most people don't even really be buried. Most people are commonly cremated nowadays. So the concept of a cemetery is perhaps your high walls, your old tombstones, things are falling apart, overgrown grass bits, areas that we don't really want to hang around in very long, do we, Hamish? That's the idea.
Not really, no. I think all landscape architects really are trying to make their open spaces as aesthetically pleasing and as inviting as possible. And, cemeteries designed by landscape architects are no exception, And I think that image of cemeteries, I think we've got Hollywood to thank for that primarily.
Yeah, exactly. So when you embarked on this sort of transition from public space in more of an open park, verges on the side of roads, etc., that sort of space, and you moved over to working within cemeteries, what were the things that sparked you going, wow, I didn't know that, or I hadn't considered that, or?
Oh, I just think it was the way the cemeteries operate. At GMCT, where I work, we have a big works crew, an operations crew, and they bury the bodies in a particular way. I just thought, like anyone else, you'd just dig a hole and throw people in, and that was that. And that's pretty much what happens, but there are all sorts of nuances to that when it comes to operations. For example, having an open space where we dig lots of little holes is not much good for drainage. So you could imagine water mixed with a body and then sort of covered over with giant slabs of granite and marble, and the imagination goes quite wild underneath. And you sort of think, well, we have to design for that because we get complaints from flooding and we get complaints about paths and access and how the machines actually access the site in order to dig the grave. And so all these tiny little considerations come to the fore. So that actually determines the way you put pen to paper and draw the lines and make these allowances. So it's not all just about making a nice space, but it's got to be very much a functional one as well.
Because I'm assuming that the maintenance and upkeep of the landscape, once you've designed it, must also take into consideration mowing and whippersnipping and the type of foliage and plants that you're actually placing in the beds nearby and those sorts of considerations.
Absolutely. When I first arrived at GMCT, and it still exists all these years later, is that the tension between, say, a tree and a grave space is really significant, because if you plant a tree, then it takes up valuable space where we can dig a hole and put a body. And so space in a cemetery is a very acute and finite sort of entity. And the question of how we're going to provide for burial space in the future is a really big question that's very difficult to answer. But we take that a bit further and we have to sell the graves, and so we've got to make them aesthetically beautiful, and what people really like is a garden type environment. And I work at Fawkner Cemetery, that's where I'm based, and that's a very old historic cemetery, and it has a mature landscape and garden around it. And just the casual interactions I have on occasion with visitors always remark that what a beautiful space it is and how comforted they feel. And I sort of really just put that down to the fact that it's landscape and garden doing its business, and providing all that. So the tension between landscape and graves is still there. So it's our task and challenge to make that all fit together.
And can you you tell us a little bit about what are the differences between the sites that you're currently managing through Greater Metropolitan?
Well, we take care of over 600 hectares of green space right across the northern parts of Melbourne, the metropolitan Melbourne. And that goes from the eastern region over from Hillsville and Lilydale down to Emerald. And then as you move west, it goes through Templestowe and Fawkner and Northern Memorial Parks, and then further over to the west through Keilor and Altona and Werribee and Williamstown.
That's a big space.
It's massive, yeah. So, yeah, it's a lot of driving it on occasion from one side to the next.
I could imagine.
But what that means is that we've got quite a vast variety of landscape and soil types. So over in the east, it's quite hilly, and the soils, generally speaking, are less clay-like and less interactive. So as you move over to the west, there's quite a high clay content in the soil. So that means that during summer it dries and cracks, and in the winter it's quite plastic. So there's a lot of movement. They're called the reactive soils. So when we build a grave on a concrete foundation, we have to take that subsoil conditions into consideration, because it means that every site is different, and we can't just simply take one methodology and just simply apply it to another. Each new investigation is exactly that. It's new. You're starting from scratch again, and you've just really got to unpack everything we can about the site.
And tell me, what was it, 2016 that you started with Greater Metropolitan? And during that time, what have you seen as the changes in your role and the sort of work that you're doing? If you can talk me through what, your role involves.
Yeah, well, I started out there as a senior landscape architect, and it was quite small. I think there was only about 3 of us, not that there's much more than that now, but the level of thinking, I think, and the level of application was very challenging. GMCT, like other Class A cemeteries, are self-funded entities. So we have to, in order to fund our enterprise, we have to sell graves. So it's a business for all intents and purposes, a not-for-profit one as it is, but it just means that we have to make sort of commercial decisions about that. But that often means just taking a space and laying out a grid and trying to maximise yield as best we can in order to maximise our revenue opportunities, because when a person or a family member buys a grave, we maintain it in perpetuity. So it means we'll mow the lawns and whippersnip, as you say, and take care of everything other than the headstone forever. So that's kind of where the money goes in. So we've got this kind of big cycle of maintenance and purchase. But at the same time, over the last 10 or so years, the advent of climate change is something that we just can't ignore anymore. So it means our practices and our processes need to be more sort of on point about sustainability and how do we treat the environment. And the fact that we know that planting trees and planted gardens lowers the heat island effect and sort of eats up the carbon and just provides us with better quality of air and to breathe and cleaner drinking water, all that kind of thing, as well as just lift the spirit and gives us a nice kind of charge, mental charge as well. So these ideas now we're trying to play more with and argue and convince that if we can incorporate these kinds of measures at the expense of, let's say, a yield or a maximum revenue income, then we'll be on the right path. But it is incredibly challenging. I can see both sides of the argument, and often we're just caught in the middle.
And it's interesting because that was the thing that really did strike me when you gave your presentation last year for Open House, was that, my background has come from 13 years at the Royal Botanic Gardens at both Cranbourne and Melbourne. So I was very sympathetic of those challenges of heritage sites and then newly designed landscapes that you have. And you have the beauty of both of those in your role. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and Harkness shortly. But also what struck me was, oh my goodness, that's right. It's real estate. And you have to manage that in amongst, the biosecurity of it, the upkeep, the climate change considerations, the sustainability. That's a whole other element that I'd never had to think of when dealing with green space.
No, that's right. So as a landscape architect, we just treat the site as another site to be designed. And rather than think about it being specifically a cemetery, that's the context that we're designing in. So we still need to apply all the principles and measures of landscape architecture and urban design and architecture, etc. But it's just in the context of a cemetery. And, that single purpose idea of a cemetery is very strong. But by applying landscape principles, then we're making them into more multi-layered or multi-purpose spaces that can provide to the local communities and local residents, etc. A public park does pretty much the same thing, and it's fairly neutral in its purpose. It doesn't bury bodies, or it doesn't have car parks, or it doesn't hold events generally. It's a bit more versatile in that respect. But a cemetery is our primary purpose and our reason for being. The Trust is providing a service to the general public to bury bodies and formalise farewells, provide cremation services, and some place to deposit the body. And so it's within that primary purpose we're saying, well, how can we continue to do that while supporting that through its secondary objectives of creating pleasant, aesthetic, nice and functional and environmentally responsible spaces. So we've just written our open space strategy, and it talks about that kind of idea between the primary and the secondary objectives.
And just going back to the diversity that you manage, can you sort of explain the differences in the sites and perhaps talk about what you're looking at with Harkness and explain to the audience what that means?
Yeah, look, GMCT doesn't, up until Harkness, didn't have much experience with large-scale greenfield sites. Greenfield site being one with absolutely nothing on it. It needs to be designed and built from scratch. And so we just thought that here's a big opportunity to realise what a cemetery of the future could be. So rather than just simply drawing up spaces and roads and gardens and landscapes, as we would normally have done in the past with some of our sites, or to continue on that methodology, we took it as an opportunity to think about, well, now into the 21st century, people's attitudes are changing, generations are coming on, the climate crisis is all pervasive. There's more people around, there's more consideration for the social and the financial as well, because the business needs to understand how it can be sustainable on that level. And of course, how we can contribute more responsibly as a steward of the land, I guess. So this is where the conceptual approach to Harkness was really important to get right in the first place. And subsequently, we undertook a fairly substantial master planning exercise that sort of addressed all these issues. I think one of the major things we did was to develop a vision for the site. So we took a step back and thought, okay, here's an opportunity. How do we realise this vision, and what kind of legacy do we want to leave, given that cemeteries are in perpetuity? So whatever we do now is going to grow and develop forever, effectively. So it's a pretty big and responsible task, and something I felt like we had to get right.
And tell me, what was involved in that master planning process?
It's just like any kind of normal master planning process. We just look at the site and understand what opportunities and constraints exist. And then it's just about, typically just applying one layer over the next that address ideas of public access, open space, building a cemetery, who our visitors are and who our customers are, as we call them, and trying to understand the site as best we can. There's a very remnants of an old creek line that runs through the length of the site. So we took this as an opportunity to be able to recharge that creek and increase and contribute to the increase of biodiversity, and start to set up wildlife corridors and try and find links between spaces that the park was in. And so also find opportunities for more passive recreational pursuits, and trying to understand that where this site was, for example, was on the outskirts of Western Melbourne. And so it's typically known as housing developments, as far as the eye can see. And it's quite a thing. People's backyards are getting smaller and the houses are getting bigger on the same plot of land.
And it doesn't seem to matter whether you're on the west or the east, the south or the north. It's pretty much the same story each direction, isn't it?
Absolutely. So cemetery, in this respect, provide a really unique opportunity to provide access to open space and nature for the residents. They might not even think about ever going to visit or bury or inter someone there, but they could treat it pretty much like a public park through active transport networks and links and nature and forests and history and flora and fauna, etc. So that was an ulterior motive, I guess. That's what I was going to say, that not only are we building a cemetery, but we're building a place that people who don't have the space can access the space.
And one of the things, if my memory serves me correctly, Hamish, was it seems that the design incorporates multiple entry points. So, a traditional cemetery generally has one entry point and it's generally very big and big gates. But you seem to really have designed the idea of just making it part of the community.
Well, that's right. So the master plan has undertaken several iterations and it's changed a lot. So I think what we tried to maintain was access. I think you have to look at a block of land like real estate in that respect and find out, what its value is. And I think if you bought a house with 2 road frontages, then that's a pretty good thing, because you can access it from either end. And we have Bullman's Road going up on one side and Harkness Road going up on the other. So this means that, we can almost create a cyclical idea and bring people into the park from both sides. And that's a long-term proposition, though, and we won't be able to achieve that for some time to come, because I just want to stress that it's 128 hectares, which is an enormous size block of land, and we can't possibly build the cemetery in one go, unfortunately. So we have to sort of stage it out bit by bit, and over the next 100 years, it'll start to build and grow and evolve.
But that comes back to your point about, I suppose, being the visionary that's actually looking at managing a parcel of land in perpetuity. And so your design has to reflect that same longevity.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the value of a master plan comes into it, because the master plan is pretty much in perpetuity. When landscape architects draw trees on bits of paper or computer now, the circles are generally represented as the mature canopy size, but that actually takes at least 20, 30 years plus to reach that size. So when we're drawing on paper, we're drawing the end result effectively. And so if we work backwards from that point, then we can work out how we can get to progress. So a method that I use is to sort of look at nature and just reproduce the mechanisms of nature. And that's just sort of splitting and dividing and reproducing the same thing, much like cells reproduce, so it becomes a pattern or an instruction on how to develop each new section.
And how much do you think that, given your background has been in art and sculpture, you've obviously always been able to see something in your mind's eye before it was created in a 3D form. How much has that ability to see things like that helped you with, designing basically a grass paddock at the moment?
Well, look, that's a really good question. And I always thought that landscape architecture was quite creative, and it is. But it wasn't until I studied art that I realised what art actually can do in a landscape architectural context. So a lot of designers feel that they can apply art, but I think, art's a big question, and you could talk about that forever as well. But it really helped me. I didn't want to become an artist. I had no aspirations to become a sculptor or anything. I just really wanted to know how to become a better landscape architect. So it made me think about ideas in a much more deeper and more broader sense. So when I could apply them to cemeteries, I could sort of look about how art could provide meaning in a cemetery context, rather than just simply plop sculpture in the landscape or build bright colours or what have you, which I found was sort of lacking in landscape architecture, that sort of relationship between art and the land. I'm a bit of a harsh critic, I think, at times, but sometimes I can't see those relationships. But I know that they exist, and I went to study art to find out what those relationships are. So when I'm doing cemeteries now, I'm looking really at top to bottom and left to right breadth of how we can inject the notion of art, rather than the aesthetic of art, the notion of art, and into the design.
And I'm assuming, or perhaps it would be great to give us some examples of how you've tried to incorporate that through your design work, Hamish.
Well, it's not easy. The notion of landscape is very technical as well. So we have to build and construct things. And whatever we do has got to have a function and a capacity. And it's costed and it's very empirical. Whereas I always sort of a bit jealous of artists. They can pretty much do what they want. And good luck to them. I reckon that's pretty fantastic. But at the same time, then, if we're going to put sort of a sculpture in the land, then it has to reflect back. So we haven't really touched upon that much at GMCT, although we have developed an art strategy. And because I really wanted to work out how to make a more high-end, let's say, for want of a better word, a high-end art collection, I think these institutions like GMCT are well placed to have really great curated collections about death and dying and in an artistic concept. But I might double up the purpose of sculpture. For example, our master plan for Lilydale, there's a nice high point, and I thought if we were to put a really thoughtful sculpture, a big one, on top of that, not only would it be a really great defining piece, but it also would function as a bit of a landmark and a bit of a talking point in the area. So everyone would then know, oh, that sculpture, that's where the cemetery is. And that cemetery, that's where the sculpture is. So, it was a bit more calculated like that, I guess. But, we haven't got anywhere close to doing that yet. But I think that as the design of Lilydale sort of unfolds and unpacks, then we'll find something appropriate. It's already master planned and on paper, so hopefully that's indelible, and it means that we'll be able to fund something like that in the future.
And you touched previously just on how there's community consultation and understanding the audience that surrounds the cemetery. What sort of considerations and design implementations or design ideas have come about in relation to the culture and the heritage of the people who live around the community and the cemetery?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and it's a really significant aspect of design, particularly in cemeteries. And I say that because we deal with everybody. We turn no one away. So that means we're bigger than the Olympic Games in terms of cultural representation. We just have everybody. So, some communities are stronger than others and more prevalent. And so we have to focus on that. Other times there are requests from smaller communities or church groups and so on. So we try to cater to that as best we can. And of course, the danger with all that is we're just starting to become a little bit more sort of mosaic, to use a nice word, of outcomes, let's say designed outcomes in a cemetery. And that's the role too. So we can't expect a completely resolved sort of space from east to west, north to south. It's going to be a collection of attitudes and preferences and perceptions.
Because some of the things that come to mind when you're mentioning this is, I know that Muslim faith, they need to be buried in the earth directly. So that's one particular consideration. I believe the Jewish faith, they have to be buried in a particular way of what they're facing, what particular direction on the compass they're facing. I can't recall off the top of my head which one. And then you've also have cultures that value water as well as significance. So how do you balance all of this in a design?
With great difficulty.
Yeah.
A predominant burial type to cater for the Islamic faith, and we call them directional graves because they need to be facing, the body when it's laid in the hole needs to be facing Mecca, effectively. So they call it directionals because the grave is slightly oriented, depending on which side it is, towards Mecca. And it's a relatively consuming kind of approach because the graves are all single rows generally, because the bodies are not head to head or tail to tail, they're head to tail, if that makes sense. So they're all facing the same direction. So it means that when we have to dig a grave, we have to come from a certain direction in order for our machinery to enable that to happen. So we can't put double rows, although we're trying that in a development at the moment just to try and, to make better use of the available space, really. But again, the water, you mentioned water, and that's generally appeals to the Asian culture. And so we've got to find that. And that, I think, is generally more symbolic and visual. But we try to, if we do that and develop sort of drainage systems, that's our only real way of putting water in these days. We're going away from pits and pipes into more open swales and trying to hold water on site so it becomes more aesthetically pleasing, but at the same time, that's really good environmental practice as well, to just keep the ground hydrated and cater for bigger and larger storms. And so we still have lots of people who want to be buried in their monumental type graves. They're the big ones you see that look more Gothic in their sort of representation. And then there's still quite a demand for public mausoleum as well. So we've got several public mausoleum across our sites, and that's just because people's preference is to be out of the ground.
And so for people who are unfamiliar with mausoleum, could you explain the structure and how that's built and how it differs?
Well, yeah, look, the risk of sounding crass, there's no easy way to put this, but the bodies are stacked in coffin-sized concrete containers, and we build the mausoleum by stacking all these pods together in a grid that may be up to about, I think, 5 high, and then we sort of build a building around that. And it's generally a sort of an indoor-outdoor building, so it's publicly accessible at all times. And we've got some pretty clever architects that know how to do that, and they do it really well. So, yeah, pretty amazing sort of things, because you might think that putting a body in the ground, it just might be a better option in terms of its deterioration and composition. But you think that a body in a sealed concrete pod stacked up way off the ground can therefore mean that the the deterioration of the body, let's say, all the needs to be allowed for. If ever left anything in the fridge for a long time, you'll begin to know what I'm talking about. So,
and this is the thing, is that there's so many considerations because the body does deteriorate over time. And what you were mentioning previously in relation to the soil types and how they respond, if you even plant a plant and in your backyard and you water it over a period of time, the soil soaks down over a period of time and you may have to top it up with mulch or whatever. So the challenges are still the same with you, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, look, after I started working at GMCT, in order to educate myself, I thought I'll go to an exhumation and just stomach that and see what it's all about. And as the body came up out of the ground, it was still quite intact. It was a very strange sight, and the person was wearing the suit that they'd been buried in, even though the body had been in the ground for over 10 years. I mean, the skeletal remains was pretty grisly, but the clothes the person was wearing or had been buried in were still quite intact. So why is that, to the funeral director? And they said, well, it's because of the synthetic fibres. They're plastics, and so they don't break down. And the body was had been soaked in preservatives and formaldehyde and other chemicals, presumably, and made up before at the funeral. So the coffins were laminated in plastic handles. So they were pulling up bits of plastic shards out of the hole to clean it out. So when you bury a body, it can be quite an inorganic process because of the clothes, because of the coffin. So there's now a move away from that, I think, now. And then more biodegradable coffins are being chosen as well as a better way to decompose the body.
And I think that leads into that movement also to see an increase in demand for natural burial too, Hamish.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and so we're still pretty new at that, even though we've had natural burial sites for a little while now. I think we're tasked with developing a site at the moment, and so we're really going into the analysis of it. It sounds really simple that you can do natural burial. You just dig a hole, throw a body in, done. But it's so much more complicated than that. In essence, that's what it's about. But the idea of natural is something that I think about. So what is natural and what are people's expectations of what natural is? Well, there's hard and fast rules about that. It may be that you don't allow diggers run by diesel motors to dig the hole, because that's an environmental footprint. So it goes against being natural. So from that point right down to how you mark the body, how you prepare the body for the hole, and more importantly, where you put the body. So people look at a bushland and go, oh, that's natural. That's what I want to be buried in. And we're trying to develop that at the moment. But at the same time, we just can't bury anywhere because we're frightened that if we upset existing tree roots, we're going to kill the tree and the vegetation. And then suddenly over the next 10 years, there's dead trees everywhere and we would have failed. So we're developing this sort of technique that we hope can mitigate those kinds of risks and still provide the experience. But we're also, rather than just go from straight into natural burials, we're trying to think of them more now as, say, bushland burials to sort of ease off on the strict protocols behind natural burial. That's not to say people still can't do that if that's what their wishes are, but it just allows us to provide that space for them a little bit easier.
And whereabouts are you looking at doing this, Hamish, for those that may be interested in finding out more?
Yeah, look, we're just developing, we have a space out at the Hillsville Cemetery. We've got one at Lilydale, I think, as well, even though it's in a very constructed sort of landscape. So the idea of natural is perhaps a bit questionable. But at the same time, if all you want to do is avoid coffins and cremation, then that can provide for that as well.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Because you have landscapes that you have something like Harkness, which, you can design and you can have your vision and that can come about. But you're also already dealing with built landscape, hard landscape in other places where you have constraints in which you have to work in as well. So how do you find those challenges when you're sort of trying to retrofit sort of design elements to those environments?
Look, I think they're extremely difficult. We're trying to extract every available piece of space. And, take Williamstown, for example. It's a very historic cemetery. It's been going forever and a day, and there's really not much space left, if any at all, there. And a few years ago, we found an opportunity, but we were really just almost driving a round peg in a square hole, or square peg in a round hole, whatever it is. And so what we're dealing with is an existing and historic structure of graves, and then trying to put brand new ones in and hoping that we don't, break the drainage system, and we can actually provide or improve it at times. And it might be that we need to provide sort of better access, because we have to think about all abilities access. So it means steps and ramps and handrails. That's all got to be considered. And when we're shoehorning these into a really tight space, it can be really difficult because we have to make it so it's profitable for us at the same time. And so the challenge is enormous, yeah.
And the other thing that comes to mind that I've had a little bit of experience with running events in historic gardens, do you have all of the maps for the underground services on where you're trying to do all of this work?
No. No, some of them were drawn a long, long time ago and rolled up in sealed boxes down in the basement, I think. But no, look, as a matter of course, we're trying to develop our site analysis and due diligence activities to try and just understand the site that we're working in. So first thing we'll do is go and get a surveyor or go and get some geotech done or prove where the services underground are and find out what challenges we're up against before we start designing. But we're sort of under pressure so much to just keep up with demand that building these landscapes, designing and constructing these landscapes can take enormous amounts of energy and time, and we don't always have the time to afford because people keep dying. So we're at this rate, and I tell you, there's never a dull moment and there's never downtime.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Business. Yeah.
And I have to say that's something that does come to mind, and just on something that you touched about previously, is that if anyone's travelled Eastlink to sort of Peninsula Link in the last few years, if they have a look to their left just before Thompson's Road, they may be wondering what's being all the construction going on over there. And if anyone who is familiar with that, they may be aware of that's Bunurong Memorial Park. And what we're seeing is the section of the cemetery that is dedicated to people of the Muslim faith, and that's their area. And I cannot believe how quickly it is filling up.
Oh, it's incredible. When developing the River Red Gum Parkland area at Northern Memorial Park over the last 10 years, and when I arrived, it was really a greenfield site, and now it's completely developed, or all but completely developed. We're doing stage 2 now, but the empty spaces we thought would last a long time are just filling at a rapid pace. We have to design a lot of car parks in our cemetery sites, understandably. But if you visit one of these spaces, the car parks are always empty. So it's a conundrum because the car parks were full maybe for about an hour and then they're all empty again. So we thought we need to provide car parks, but one day the cemetery is going to be full and then what happens next? So the clever design for River Red Gum is that we can peel up these car parks and create remaining burial spaces. And we've already done that with one car park. We thought it would last another 10 years, but we've already pulled up one car park and have just built directional graves for the Islamic community there. And I think they've just about all sold out too. So it's crazy.
And just designing in a space that River Red Gums are predominantly in, such as that space that you're referring to, and other areas that you've worked on, what consideration is given to First Nations cultural consultation in relation to that landscape and those designs?
Well, the short answer is very little. And it struck me a few years ago when I was learning about cemeteries, and I thought to myself that we cater for all cultures. We always talk about culture all the time, but we include all cultures, or we did include all cultures, except one, and that was our Indigenous one. And I thought, well, that's a huge gap. So from that point, we sort of started making more effort to engage with our traditional owners. And then we sort of started to understand a little bit more about why this is a good thing, particularly with their skills of land management and maintenance over the last 60,000 years. So when we kicked off the Harkness Master Plan, that was very conscientiously included a lot of consultation and engagement with the traditional owners. Normally, that starts with developing a cultural heritage management plan. And from that point on, we work out what the limitations are, what the opportunities are, how can we sort of work that into our designs, how that can be applied, how we can make that more relevant to the general public and just be truly inclusive on that level.
Well, it's lovely to hear that that work is being done and that there is a shift in the way in which we view inclusivity in relation to all cultures, as you said.
Yeah, makes sense.
And in relation to, as you were saying, and it seems to be coming up time and time again when we're talking about design, is we've only got so much green space in the cities, and I certainly became very aware of this when I travelled overseas recently and was in Milan and thought, I'll check out their cemetery. And we manage ours in perpetuity. However, there is a lot of overdue notices on cemetery, on gravestones and in the mausoleum in Milano Central. And I thought, what does that mean for us, Hamish, when we've only got so far we can have land? What have you seen that may be the future of design and how we accommodate burying people when we have limited space?
Yeah, it's the eternal question. It's a bit of a luxury here in Australia, I think. I think in Europe and other places, there's this thing called tenure where they exhume the body and dispose of it if the family no longer requires it. But here it's in perpetuity and off it goes. It just sort of disappears into the ether over time. But look, when we think about space, we have to change the attitudes. I think about burial and how that might happen. And I think that the way we do that is to combine that with new techniques of body disposal. And it's very old sort of style of burying a body in a coffin and putting it in the ground. And there are newer techniques that I'd be keen to see developed here in Victoria and Australia in general, such as composting, which has been developed in the US. And it's really composting a body in a rapid sort of process. So the outcome or the remains are, as I understand it, a bag of soil. So, you can do what you want with that soil. The particular business in America has a relationship with regenerating a decimated forest. So their idea of giving back to the environment is that if you don't know what to do with your remains, help us regenerate this forest with nutrient. And so to me, it's a fabulous idea, and my long-term vision for the new cemetery or the eventual cemetery is just a garden or a forest where you see no headstones, you don't see any bodies, but it's all constructed or created through fertilised forest floor, So it becomes a very sacred kind of space in its own right, I think. So there's that. There's other sort of techniques. Natural burial, obviously, that we've talked about, is also becoming quite popular. But I think that the challenges are big. If you follow real estate in any way, shape, or form, you'll know that things are just getting more and more expensive. And so for us to go and buy land, which is a lengthy process in the first place, that is often on the outskirts of the city, meaning the travel times are much greater, and we need to develop larger parcels to try and shore up the future. But look, maybe we should follow Brazil or Japan, where they fit out an office building, or we house them in another kind of way, or what have you. I think the first point is to sort of start to change people's attitudes about what they expect when they expect to die, when they think they're going to die, or what that outcome is.
And I suppose on that, staying with that thought of perhaps challenging people's perception of what they think burial involves nowadays, as you mentioned, there's a lot of challenges with burying someone in the ground. You've mentioned soil types, you've mentioned drainage, you've mentioned just the natural decomposition and settling of the body, and then the settling of the soil with a very large tombstone or plaque, on top of it, and managing those and then maintaining it and growing things on top. So the thing that surprised me when I saw it was at Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust at Bunurong, was that we're using modern day techniques to help mitigate those challenges by using concrete to actually segment areas where a person is buried. And I assume that is to actually contain that or control those issues in some way, Hamish. Why is that?
If I understand what you're saying is correct, then we pour a lot of concrete. And basically what we're doing is building concrete foundations to support the weight of a monumental grave. So as I mentioned before, the soils can be quite moving, shifting and reactive. And so we do our best to try and limit that by knowing that people want to put a very, very heavy stone monolithic structure on the ground to commemorate the family or the loved one. And so the physics of that is that something very heavy on soil needs to be supported. So we pour a lot of concrete to make that happen. So we're trying to look at ways of how can we reduce our reliance on concrete. Maybe we're investigating green concrete, that doesn't rely on the usual techniques of manufacturing. We also lay concrete beams that people can, for lawn graves, that the headstone or the plaque sits on, and we're thinking, do we need them so wide? Perhaps we can shrink them down a little bit. So it's a brilliant product, concrete. It's been around for a long time and it's proven. And so I think it's going to be here to stay for a little while. We've just got to work out how we can work with it, make it go further, if that makes sense.
Of course. Thanks for explaining that, because it makes sense that it's putting in the substructure there to support the activities that have to happen.
Yeah, just like a house or a building. Yeah, you put down a slab, build the house on top, you're good to go.
Another thing that came to mind was when you were talking about the price of real estate. And there was something that I saw that, when you were looking at a design of the cemetery, that, whenever you're closer to the water, it's always more expensive to get a plot there. The places with the view, always more expensive. And I thought it was rather amazing that in death, as in life, the ones with the view and the ones closest to the water are still the most expensive.
Sad but true, but, there's a couple of wily retailers in cemetery industries as well. So they know that, people are prepared to pay. And look, it's just a demand-supply equation as well. So if people want to commemorate, they'll pay for it. But, there's price points all over the place in every cemetery, depending on the location, depending on the outlook, depending on the product type, whether it's just a simple lawn grave or a cremated remains garden, right up to the private mausoleum where money's not an object.
And with all the things that you've seen and your experience that you've had over this time, Hamish, what's your thoughts? What's your end-of-life plans? Have you come to any decision about whether you'd like to be buried or...
Well, I tend to avoid questions like that sometimes, and I'll make a decision right at the end. But no, I'm actually quite like the idea of the composting myself. I think that just seems to be a natural process without a lot of mechanical interventions. And I think that the outcome, if I understand it correctly, is something that I feel is more spiritual. It's one thing to bury a whole body in the ground and let it decompose, but there's something about scattering, much like cremation. And if I could scatter a bag of soil around in a forest, preferably down by the beach somewhere, I'd be very content with that, I think.
I like the idea of that, being fertiliser for our future generation of trees and for animals to live in some part of those trees moving forward.
Yeah, look, my personal opinion is that humans have been fighting nature ever since we got here, and it's brought us to this point now. And I think it's just a futile fight. And I think that we should be more working with nature to let it do its thing. And I think that's one way you can do that.
Well, it sounds like things with the work that you're doing, Hamish, means that you're really paving the way in making sure that kind of happens, that we are in more harmony when we design our cemeteries of the future generations.
Yeah, thanks. It's, very challenging, but it's very rewarding at the same time.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Oh, well, I could keep talking forever about this subject. So we better call it quits.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Hamish.
No worries, Catherine. Until next time.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.